Good afternoon. If you didn't already get a copy of the next homework assignment, you can grab that after class. And by the way, there were quite a few students who didn't pick up the graded work from the last homework assignment. And so I have a box near my office door in the other engineering building, in the Weisberg Engineering Lab building. So it's a box beside my door, which is room 113, and anything you haven't picked up until now, whether it's a quiz or homework assignment, you can pick it up from that box. Okay, so your homework assignment, number 9, isn't due until Monday, but I didn't want to hold anybody back who wants to get an early start on homework 10 because it's related to benefit cost analysis, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. We'll do the first of our calculations that's related to that assignment. So if you've already got number 9 done, you can get an early start on number 10. It's due on Monday. No, that's not right. I didn't even put the date. The due date for homework 10 is Friday, next Friday. Looking a little bit further into the schedule, midterm exam 2 is due on Wednesday, and I'm still trying to sort out whether or not that'll include a question related to Excel. I have to see how long it takes me to finish grading the quizzes first to know whether that's feasible. And then, of course, the project is also looming on the horizon. So, any questions related to the announcements? All right. Well, thus far in the course, we've been focusing on ways to maximize profit. And, of course, the purpose of every company is to make money rain down from heaven, try and just get every last dollar you can. These people have a look of joy in their eyes because that's what money buys, is everlasting joy. But not every project is motivated by profit. And in fact, some projects are outright unprofitable, and yet we still do them. So we need a way to rank and order and decide among alternatives that aren't profit motivated. So that may be, for instance, food aid going to starving people across the world. Those people aren't going to pay for the food that's delivered to them, and yet society identifies that as some sort of a good that's worth doing. It may be the installation of guardrails. You know, guardrails have saved thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives of people who otherwise would have driven off of a highway, flipped the car, but by running into the guardrail, they end up with damage to their vehicle, but a much less catastrophic accident than they otherwise would have had. But people don't directly pay for guardrails. After you get in an accident, there isn't a guardrail surcharge. We don't pay, we don't give money to the guardrails as we're driving down the highway. It's the sort of thing where we know there's a cost associated with it, and someone has done an analysis to decide if the benefits outweigh the costs. And so that's what we're going to look at today, is a couple of ways to assess for projects that may not generate revenue, whether there's more benefits than costs. Another example of thing that you can't just reduce every transaction in life into profit versus loss. And highway noise is an example of that. Think about if you're living in a rather quiet neighborhood and then it's decided that they're going to put major improvements along a roadway, increase the speed of traffic, increase the volume of traffic, and so what that means is it's going to be a lot more noisy where you live. And so that's a disadvantage to you, but you're not paying out of pocket. Maybe not directly. It could affect your property values, but the noise could affect your sleep, which makes you less productive at work. Now, there are benefits associated with a highway project like this. It allows people to experience less delay. Maybe it helps to lead to economic revitalization of the area that at the end of the highway. And so what we can do is enumerate all of these benefits and costs. For example, the costs of the materials themselves, the costs of upkeep, and so on. And then weigh it all against the disadvantages. Sometimes we call the disadvantages that are experienced by the public disbenefits. And we try and identify every way that people would be negatively affected by a project. Pollution is another thing that companies often are very anxious to externalize environmental costs. And so what that means is it's very uncommon for a company to have to pay any kind of a tax based on how much pollution they put into the environment. All of us experience that pollution, whether it is polluted water or air or solid waste pollution. But it's difficult on a profit basis, for example, to clean up a polluted river. And so those sorts of projects are still undertaken, but to choose from among 4 projects like this, trying to identify where is one limited dollar that's available likely to do the most good, we have to have kind of a quantifiable system for approaching things that seem qualitative rather than quantitative. Here's an example of some public sector projects, the types of things that are financed by governments because they're not likely to be as attractive to private companies that are profit motivated. So take, for instance, a lot of these are civil engineering projects like highways, bridges, waterways, and so on. Sewer lines, gas lines, electricity. There's a big component here to just providing the basic necessities of society and keeping things running. Garbage collection, schools, and so on. And so each of these are things that may be, there may be cooperative ventures between government and private companies. We'll talk about different ways of sharing risk between the two different categories, between the public and the private. But when all comes down to it, these are things that, in spite of their lack of financial appeal, there's still enough benefit that they have to be done for the sake of society. And so sometimes these things do generate revenue. So if you have a house, you'll know that you pay for sewer, you pay for water, electricity. You'll pay fees to use an airport, for example. But almost always, when it comes to municipally owned utilities, they have to operate just sort of on a no-profit basis. Any revenue that they collect is supposed to just cover the expenses, and the extra money doesn't go to the mayor. It doesn't go back to shareholders in the same way that it does for a private company. Now, there are some private companies who engage in things like electricity. Here, the electricity is provided by AEP. The water is provided by American Water, and both of those are for-profit companies, but their profits are regulated by the state, by something called a Public Utilities Commission, who in theory is supposed to keep the rates low and just enough to cover the costs and some preset profit. In reality, the regulator in West Virginia is pretty weak. The lawyers for the electric company and the lawyers for the water company have a lot more resources at their disposal, and so whenever they want a rate increase, they just sort of go right over the lawyers that are at the Public Utility Commission, and it's been a long time since they said no to a rate increase. We pay a lot more for water, for example, in West Virginia than just about any other place in the United States. More than they pay in New Mexico. We pay more than they pay in Arizona, Texas. We've got an abundance of water just within 100 yards of the city limit, but somehow the water rates here are the highest in the country. And it's largely because there's sort of been a corruption on what ought to be a public sector project, and it's been taken over by a for-profit entity. So let's compare and contrast some of the characteristics of public projects versus private projects. And one of the differences is related to the size of the investment required. Because sometimes it's not that a revenue can't be generated. Sometimes the problem is just that it's so costly to undertake the project that there are few or no private companies who can do it. Think of a dam, for example. Dams are projects that are designed to last for more than 100 years, and the construction costs can go into the billions. And so the size of the investment typically is very large for public projects and smaller for most private projects. And I've already talked about the lifespan for public projects. And this is another reason why sometimes the government has to step in for certain projects, because remember, future revenues aren't worth very much in today's terms. And so any project that's going to last for 50 years, for example, you're having to spend money today for revenue so far in the future that that future revenue really isn't worth very much at all in today's terms, because you're discounting it with such a large N. And so a private company will often look at that and say, well, those future revenues aren't worth as much to me, and that's one of the motivating factors for a public entity to step in. Annual CF, that means cash flow, and private projects are profit-driven, whereas public projects, the good ones will break even, but even a lot of good ones sometimes don't break even. Think about a public park. No parks department is ever paying for itself through craft fees or bake sales, that sort of thing. And they're always more expensive than they get back. The source of the money required for the initial investment is different as well. Private companies raise money through either equity or debt instruments. Equity means that you become a partial owner of the company, and so therefore you're a partial owner of the project. In terms of public, you don't become a partial owner of a project in the same way that you would for a private project. So the municipality may sell bonds, for example, to finance a sewer. You can buy the bonds and you'll get a fixed pre-negotiated rate of return for those bonds, but that doesn't make you an owner of the sewer system since it's a debt instrument. When taxes go to pay for a project, you have to pay your taxes. That's a legal obligation that the government imposes, but it doesn't mean that you are an owner. Someone who pays more taxes than another person doesn't have any more access to public projects than anybody else. One of the advantages that public entities have compared to companies is that often they have a better credit rating, and it's cheaper for them to borrow money. So you'll notice here on interest rate it says private companies have higher interest rates, meaning that's how much they have to pay to borrow funds, compared to lower interest rates for a public agency. So why do you expect, for example, that the U.S. government can raise money at a lower interest rate? They have to pay interest to people at a lower interest rate than, let's say, for instance, General Electric. Yeah. What's that? So you're saying like the cash supply? Yeah, I think the Treasury and the Federal Reserve are independent. I mean, I definitely get your point, but that's not exactly the main reason why creditors see the U.S. government as such a safe investment. Because, if they thought, well, the government's just going to print more money to pay the debts, then that money that was excess printing would cause inflation, and then that wouldn't do them any good. So there's something else they're counting on. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So he said the investors who buy a government bond know that the government has the ability to raise the money because the U.S. government has an exclusive franchise on collecting taxes from the people who live in the United States. And so, the U.S. is one of the most productive, largest economies in the world, and the federal government is able to tax that. It's a good revenue base that they can collect from. And so people consider the U.S. government to have an attractive credit rating, and so interest rates are lower as a result. Now, all the things I'm talking about are the sorts of ideas and concepts you should be ready to discuss in a short answer on the exam. So I see that some of you are taking notes, and I think that's great. Helps you to remember some of these ideas. It's also described in the book as well. Selection criteria is talking about how to decide from among alternatives. In the case of a for-profit company, they select projects based on whatever gives them the most profit or has the highest incremental rate of return. Remember the criteria being if the rate of return is greater than the MAR, the project is acceptable, and from many different alternatives, the most expensive one that still justifies by having a higher rate of return than the MAR, that's the one that you choose. And so because of that focus just on profits, then the decisions are economic, predominantly for private companies. So if Schwinn moves to Mexico, they don't necessarily care if people in Indiana are losing jobs. It's just the company becomes richer by making some move, and so it's an economic decision. Public projects have to balance a lot of competing interests. You know, that's politics, is balancing and negotiating a balance between competing interests. And so it may be the people that are living in a certain area, it may be their bondholders, it could be a lot of factors that dictate how projects are selected. One other point to make is that the government doesn't have unlimited money. Even though they can raise it at a good rate, eventually that has to be repaid, and a lot of people are rightly anxious about the ballooning federal budget deficit and the ever-increasing federal debt. People worry about that. And so the government has to pay off those debts by collecting taxes. And in order to pay taxes, they have to take money from people. I mean, the money doesn't come from nowhere. And it's generally agreed that people can spend their own money more efficiently and with a greater utility than the government can spend it. And there's waste and inefficiency and fraud and programs that end up not being effective, whereas most people know what they need to spend their money on. And so we, at the back of our minds, when we're comparing projects and deciding whether to move forward with some sort of a public investment, we have to keep in mind that we're taking money away from people in order to do it. So we shouldn't select frivolous projects. Now here's the tricky part, and this is really more of an art than a science, and that is trying to monetize things that may not really have a close relationship to money. Remember, we were talking about highway noise. How much noise is equivalent to how much money? There are sociologists and economists that have to go in and study those things. They have to look at disturbed sleep patterns and the relationship between disturbed sleep and a decrease in workplace efficiency. They have to look at dissatisfaction relationship to noise. And so we have to monetize things that are benefits, like improved travel time. That's a little bit easier to monetize, saved travel time, because we have the expense of burning excess fuel, sitting in traffic, keeps us away from work. It reduces the number of deliveries that UPS can do, for example. But sometimes, especially when it comes to disbenefits, it's more challenging to monetize the effects of a project. So here are the definitions of each of the terms that are going to go into our formula. We have a special formula. It's a ratio of benefits to costs. And here's what we assign to each of these variables. First of all, benefits have to be advantages to the public. So if we're doing a project and a certain contractor gets the contract to build a road, we're not considering the benefits to the contractor. He's really happy to get a paving contract, but those aren't the benefits we're talking about. We're talking about the benefits to the people who are supposed to be using it after it's constructed. So it can be things like better safety, environmental protection, improved recreation. It may bring economic development, and we can consider improved economic development. In some ways, that's a general good, although the benefits in some cases are disproportionate to the people who use the service. For example, if the Tri-State Airport was expanded, people who would be disproportionately benefited by that would be business people who travel a lot. The average person may fly in and out of that airport once a year or something, but it would be the frequent traveler who benefits. And so, when we're assigning certain quantities to each of these variables, we have to, during the negotiation process and selection process, keep an eye on who in the public is receiving the benefits and who in the public is receiving the disbenefits. So take, for example, if a highway is put through an inner city area, the disbenefits are disproportionately experienced by people who live near the freeway. But everyone who drives on the freeway is experiencing the benefits. And so that may be people in the suburbs, or it can be cross-country travelers. And so we have to be really careful and consider social justice issues to make sure that the disbenefits aren't concentrated. And this is something that's becoming increasingly important, is looking at our people who don't vote as often and who don't have as much money to hire lawyers to represent their interests. In other words, are poor people disproportionately affected when big projects are undertaken? I mean, the answer is yes, and so increasingly it's becoming important to consider who experiences these disbenefits. The costs, thankfully, are straightforward. It's the same thing that we've been doing before, where we're trying to quantify the initial construction cost as well as the ongoing operational costs related to maintenance and repair of whatever is putting into service. Pretty uncommon to have a salvage value on these long-term projects, partly because, let's say in the case of a pipe network, we hope for it to be in place for 100 years, and so any scrap value of a pipe network in 100 years is negligible in terms of today. It's also not likely to have a salvage cost because we're not talking about equipment so much as development of infrastructure. So it's not a tractor, for instance. Now, I told you we've got a formula that's a ratio that uses these variables. We have to take everything to a common time frame. So if we have annual costs, we can't put the annual costs and the present value of the benefits into the same formula. In other words, we have to take every one of these factors either to the present, the future, or to an annual basis. Now here's the idea of sharing risk. There are some types of contracts where a contractor who's executing the project doesn't share the risk of the outcome, or has a very small share of the project outcome risk. There are some projects where just at the beginning, before it begins, the contractor agrees to a certain price for building the project, and they get a lump sum payment regardless of how much it actually costs them to build it. And so they may have some incentive there to cut corners. If they're only getting a fixed price and they want to maximize their profit, then that gives them maybe a disproportionate incentive to not necessarily do the right thing. Sometimes to avoid that risk of the disincentive against quality, cost reimbursable projects are undertaken. And there you tell someone who's undertaking a project that you'll cover their costs plus give them some small fraction for profit. And engineering companies often will get their design fees based on the size of a project. So for example, if a highway is going to be a $10 million, a certain stretch of road is $10 million, then maybe the engineering company that designs that stretch of the road would get 15% of the project as their fee. And so then they'd get $1.5 million. Now, can anybody think of a reason why that may be a bad idea for an engineering company to get a percentage of the overall cost as their fee? Yeah. Right. Yeah, so in that case, the engineering company would have a direct incentive to maximize the cost of the project. So they don't want to save their client money. I mean, maybe ethically they do, but the bottom line, the profit loss statement of the company is saying, well, we should make this project as expensive as possible because we get 15% of whatever this project ends up costing. So there are new models that are being increasingly used that are called public-private partnerships. And that's where a state agency or a university or some sort of a municipal group is going to get together with a contractor and find ways to share the risk and to share the benefits of a project. So design build is where a contractor is both designing and constructing a project, and there are really careful incentives put into place to ensure that what they build has a high quality and to try and minimize the expense. And so they'll build in incentives for cost savings, for example. Yeah, definitely. The other alternative for trying to find ways to share risk with contractors is what's called design, build, operate, maintain, finance. So I would assume everyone here has been to the Marshall Rec, right? I mean, you might as well go since you're paying for it. It's not optional. You have to pay that fee, right? The reason why is that that rec center was built by a private company who, for now, owns and operates the rec. And so part of the agreement was that Marshall would require its students to have memberships, and then this company would have a guaranteed stream of revenue. From what I've heard, at the end of a certain period of time, I think it's 20 years of operation, then Marshall is going to own that building, and they didn't have to pay anything up front for it. They didn't have the money to build a new rec, and so that's part of the reason why they partnered with a company. And so that company that built it and maintains it, they have a big incentive for it to be a nice structure because they're going to be operating it for a 20-year period. And so they have a built-in incentive to minimize costs and maximize the operability of whatever's being built. So here's the formula. We're going to spend the next several class periods working with variations of this. The benefit to cost ratio. So B is benefits, D is disbenefits, which are those especially tricky things to somehow quantify in dollar terms. When we begin with, those will just be provided. You know, it's sort of like we'll assume that an economist or a social scientist has done all the legwork and has been able to quantify disbenefits for us. In the denominator here, we add together both types of costs, the initial construction cost and also the maintenance and operation costs. Now, we can do this on a present worth basis. We can do it on an annual worth basis, and we'll get the same ratio regardless of what basis we do it on. There's something called a modified B to C ratio that I won't ask you to do the modified ratio in the homework, but just so that you're aware it's out there. There is a school of thought that says rather than putting the ongoing operational costs into the denominator, you should subtract them from whatever benefits there are. It doesn't really matter which of the two you use when you're comparing alternatives, because whichever alternative looks best according to the conventional method will also be the alternative that looks best according to the modified. But occasionally, how good a project is would be affected by which of the two you use. This criteria is really important here. If the B to C ratio is either greater than or equal to 1, that means that you should do the project. Otherwise, you should reject it. And what that ratio means is that the benefits are outweighing the costs if it's above 1. And in quasi-financial terms, it means for every dollar that you spend, you're going to be getting more than $1 of benefit if the B to C ratio is greater than 1. So a good project is one where you get $3 or $4 worth of benefit for every dollar that's spent. From the standpoint of a contractor, they're not experiencing the disbenefits. You know, the person who maybe has won the right to operate a toll road. You know, sometimes private contractors will operate a toll road, and so the noise, they don't have to, that's not going to affect their bottom line, but they would maybe have to be concerned with the ratio of the benefits to the costs. And so just so that you're aware of the definition, this profitability index is the benefits minus the ongoing operational costs divided by the initial investment. And again, just to reemphasize, usually C sub I is a present worth in the problem statement, and usually the maintenance and operation will be an annual amount. So you'll have to convert it from annual to present before you combine it with everything else. Or you'll have to convert whatever's in the present to an annual basis. Benefits are often annual as well, because the benefits accumulate over the duration of the project. Any questions so far? Okay, so here's today's in-class exercise. Does anybody need a copy of the paper? Everybody have that? All right, so we have a project which is a new highway, and the government is going to partner with a private firm to do it. The study period is 20 years, and that could be related to how long the pavement is expected to last, if it's concrete that's well formed, hopefully. And we're using a discount rate of 4%, and that's probably a reflection of the borrowing cost that's faced by this government agency. So in the problem statement, it's telling you what is the construction costs, the maintenance cost, revenue and benefits, disbenefits. We're going to solve this one by hand. We've been doing a lot of Excel lately, but you'll notice on the back side of the paper is the 4% table. So when you're converting between annual and present values, use the 4% table, and you can utilize the lookup factors there. So steps A through G kind of takes you through one by one what you need to do in order to decide whether this project should be undertaken. Let me bring the formulas back up on the screen because E, F, and G are asking you to calculate the ratios and also calculate the profitability index. And so here are those formulas. All right, that may be a little hard to see. Let me see if I can zoom in a little. If you didn't manage to finish up all of the calculations, I'd encourage you to work on that at home. If you need to double check your solution with the key, it'll be on the YouTube recording. And the links to those, by the way, is in the course website. If you go to MU Online, then you can get to the lecture recordings through a link that's there. Have a great weekend. Everybody get a copy of the new homework assignment.